Catherine Wheatley from King's College London, just down the road. And Catherine's presentation this afternoon is entitled Little Deaths Every Day, Film's Perception of Everyday Violence.
Thank you. Yes, so I've come over to enemy territory. We don't normally set foot in UCL. Thank you very much, Layla, for inviting, and Emma for inviting me to be here. And thank you all very much for staying the course. It's much appreciated. There is always a problem with coming last, and I've felt it very strongly today, as I ever do, which is that I want to toss my paper out and rewrite the whole thing, because I've had so many inspiring thoughts. So thank you all for the brilliant papers that I've seen. And I think there are some confluences and convergences that will hopefully come out as I'm talking. Today I'm going to be showing you 4 clips, God willing, if the tech is playing ball. In the first, we see a married couple giving each other massages. In the second, a middle-aged woman accepts an offer to spend Christmas with her estranged husband. In the third, a pair of young men forge a friendship based on conversation and horseplay. And in the fourth and final one, a young woman, frustrated by the banal chatter of her 2 male companions, throws herself into the River Seine before swimming securely to safety. None of these scenes could be described as explicitly violent, and none of the films they feature in could be described as violent movies. In fact, some have been heralded as great romances or comedies. Nonetheless, by the end of the next 50 minutes or so of talking, I hope to have shown how each of these scenes tells us something about how the seeds of violence or gender-based violence are sown in the everyday interactions between men and women, and how films can prompt us to recognise that. So in accepting this assignment to say something about film philosophy and gender-based violence, that is, I have interpreted it a little bit idiosyncratically. I won't be talking about violence in films, not the countless bloody images of misogyny that have appeared in over a century of screen rapes and murders, nor the taking of depictions to task by generations of feminist filmmakers. Such films, no doubt, have very important lessons to teach us about how to think about gender-based violence, as thinkers such as Catherine Angel, Amir Srinivasan, and of course Jacqueline Rose have argued. Rather, my interest here, following Stanley Cavell, is in the imbrication of gender-based violence with the modern condition of skepticism, a condition that, in his words, leads us to suffer and to deal countless little deaths every day in a way that is explicitly gendered. And I want to show how this death-dealing impulse is, in fact, really quite gendered, but also how film in all its forms can begin to call our attention to the ubiquity of violence, and in so doing ask us what we might do differently. And I'm very aware, I've been thinking about that question that Hugo raised via Maid, and that Eileen asked in another way, which is what counts as violence, what counts as abuse. And I was really interested, Eileen, in that kind of transition from the very middle-class white violence that's implicit in To the Lighthouse to the sort of structural societal violence that is perpetuated over and over again in other cultures and in different classes of society. And there is a slight mea culpa here, because I am talking about a very white and privileged kind of violence, but I think there are ways in which it might open out into other types of violence beyond gender that might extend to race and sexuality as well. But that might be, if we have any time and energy for question and answers, that might come next. And I should also apologise, because there are a couple of people in the audience that I know are very well versed in Stanley Cavell's philosophy. I have got a bit of exegesis here for those that might be less familiar. I'll try and keep it quicker, given how late we are in the day. But for those who are... Oh, nothing's happening. I'll keep talking and hope that we can make it work. For those who are less familiar with Cavell's philosophy, let me begin by explaining the central place of... Can we click on to the next one? Of skepticism to his... Is it this? Yeah, okay. Skepticism to his thought, and then I'll move on to the relationship to violence. As many of you no doubt know, underpinning all of Cavell's work is a concern with the crisis of doubt that has befallen mankind in the modern era, what he refers to as an unhinging of our consciousness from the world, as a result of which our subjectivity became what is present to us. Individuality becomes isolation. This loss of connection to the world functions on numerous levels and is quasi-religious in tone, and has at least in part to do with the death of God in secular culture, as Andrew was mentioning earlier. Indeed, much of Cavell's work is shot through with a Judeo-Christian sensibility, which I think colours how he writes about gender. But that might be something we pick up in question and answer. Roughly speaking, up until the Reformation, the presence and transparency of the world was guaranteed to us by a divine Christian God. Now, transcendental securities have irretrievably disappeared, and we are trapped within our subjectivities, unsure of anything beyond our own selves. Cavell understands scepticism to be modern humankind's condition, stripped of those certainties provided first by religion, the belief in God, and then by state. Our consciousness was and remains unhinged from the world. We might think of this as the disappearance of a common objective point of view from which to understand and feel the world. Our newly revealed subjectivity comes between us and our presentness to the world. William Rothman and Marion Keane put it this way: the world as it is cannot satisfy the wish for the world, our wish to have this world, to possess it, or at least to be meaningfully connected to it. Of course, this is an uncomfortable position to inhabit, living in a world that we cannot connect to, cannot perhaps even see. We certainly cannot know, to come back to a word that's been used over and over again today. The result of this discomfort is that the last 500 years, mankind has become obsessed with finding some way, any way, of believing in the world, through romanticism, through science, through politics. But our wish to recover the world threatens to destroy it altogether. Cavell describes the will to know the world, to overcome scepticism, as violent, grasping, an act of dominion. At the close of his magnum opus, The Claim of Reason, he compares our relationship to the world to that of Shakespeare's Othello to Desdemona, writing that, "What I will find in Othello's relation to Desdemona is not just initiated by the human being's relationship to the world, in particular by that phase of its career in which the human being makes to secure or close its knowledge of the world's existence once and for all, only to discover it to be closed off forever." One realises how long Cavell's sentences are when you try and read them out loud. Big breath. But also that their relation remains to the end a certain allegory of that career. The consequent implication is that there is between human existence and the existence of a world the standing possibility of a death-dealing passion, of a yearning at once unappeasable and unsatisfiable, as of an impossible exclusiveness and completeness. So what philosophy knows as doubt, that is, Othello's violence allegorizes as a form of masculine jealousy. And as another aside here, and again, something that if we have time, we might want to pick up on, I found myself thinking a lot today about the use of sexual and gender violence as a metaphor and what the ethical implications of that are. And of course, Cavell is using Othello's relationship to Desdemona as a metaphor for scepticism. And I think what I'd like to do in my talk is try and reverse that metaphor so that scepticism gets us to think properly about the psychology of gender violence. Cavell expounds on his use of Othello as a metaphor in a book of essays on Shakespeare's plays, Disowning Knowledge. Here he writes that Othello seeks, and I'm quoting, "a possession that is not in opposition to another's claim or desire, but one which establishes an absolute or inalienable bonding to himself, as if the jealousy is directed to the sheer existence of another, its separateness from him." Cavell's equation of scepticism with tragedy implies that the sceptic's passionate desire for the world is indeed death-dealing, just as Othello murders Desdemona because he cannot know her entirely. To paraphrase the philosopher Stephen Mulhall, Desdemona dies at his hands because he pictures his relationship to her as an appropriation of her. The world has receded from us, slipped beyond our grasp, and attempts to regain it threaten to destroy it entirely, as if capturing a butterfly between our palms. This is one way in which the modern condition of scepticism ends in the destruction of the world, through a passion to possess that is so strong as to stifle it. But Cavell draws on another of Shakespeare's plays, King Lear, to explain how we might equally destroy the world through a lack of attention to it or contempt for it. Lear's dismissal of his daughter Cordelia for refusing to profess her love, and his failure to recognise that refusal as in fact being its own declaration of love, parallels our turning our back on the world as if to punish it for its retreat. In this scenario, the world and the daughter alike, by failing to make themselves known entirely, become painful reminders of our own powerlessness, unbearably so. And so Lear rejects his daughter as we reject the world, such that, and this is Mulhall again, it goes dead. This rejection is no less an annihilation, that's Cavell's word, than Othello's murder of his lover. In both cases, we are confronted with a realm in which, as Hannah Arendt puts it, man cannot change and cannot act, and in which, therefore, he has a distinct tendency to destroy. So the world is lost to us, and any attempt to pin it down or pretend it doesn't exist destroys it altogether. These attempts are death-dealing. What does this have to do with film? Well, having sketched in Cavell's philosophical account of our modern condition and its use of death as a metaphor, I want to turn now to film as a medium and examine its relationship to these concepts before looking at a couple of examples of particular films, what Cavell calls good films, and to see what they can teach us about living with skepticism, about living with gender violence. Oh, I've missed a slide. In his first book on film proper, The World Viewed, Cavell tells us that film's privileged relationship to skepticism connects ontology to epistemology. Film, at least in its traditional age, at once reassures us that we can know the world and reminds us that we can't. While painting offers us subjective views of the world, film gives us the world mechanically reproduced, the world as it is presented to you. But this world that the film makes present to us is one from which we are absent, unlike theatre, say. It causes live human beings and real objects in space to appear to us when they're not there, making present a world of the past, a world that recedes beyond our grasp. Cavell thus calls cinema in its traditional form a moving image of skepticism, in part because it satisfies our sense of reality, even while that reality does not exist for us. More than this, it satisfies our sense of reality in this way precisely because the reality that is made present does not exist in our current time and space, because, and I'm quoting here, viewing it is all it takes. Watching a film, that is, the spectator must understand that they play no part in the action. They are powerless to intervene. And that is both a relief and a reminder that outside the cinema, despite our lack of knowledge of the world, we are nonetheless called to acknowledge it and its inhabitants. As Cavell writes, I'm quoting now, "I know that there is inexplicable pain and death everywhere. And now, if I ask myself why I do nothing, the answer must be, I choose not to. That is, doing nothing is no longer something which has a place ensured by ceremony. It is the thing that I am doing. And it requires the same energy, the same expense of cunning and avoidance that tragic activity used to have to itself. Film is an ordinary medium, one that is easily accessible and largely democratic. And this comes back to a question that was asked of Eileen, I think, earlier about audiences and consumption. It's very important to Cavell that any film, so any of the examples that I give today, but I could easily have spoken, and I almost did speak about a Disney film, in fact, has this same power for us. It's also, and this is crucial, a medium that is often interested in the ordinary world. Yes, we have biblical epics and flights of fancy and science fiction spectacles, but many of the popular films of the 1940s and 50s, when Cavell was regularly attending the cinema, are concerned with the everyday lives of men and women, and I'll come back to this in due course. Most of all, though, film has the power to draw our attention to what Cavell calls the physiognomy of the ordinary. in a way that other arts cannot. And as such, it can reawaken the everyday powers of being fully alive to the expressions of others in word and deed that we seem to have lost or neglected through habit, familiarity, inattention and dullness. And Cavell writes that, quote, "I understand it to be, let me say, a natural vision of film that every motion and station, in particular every human posture and gesture, however glancing, has its poetry. You may say its lucidity. Any of the arts will be drawn to this knowledge, this perception of poetry of the ordinary, but film, I would like to say, democratizes this knowledge, hence at once blesses and curses us with it. It says that the perception of poetry is open to all, regardless, as it were, of birth or talent, as the ability is to hold a camera on a subject, so that a failure to perceive, to persist in missing the subject, is ascribable only to ourselves, to failures of our character, as if to fail to guess the unseen from the seen, to trace the implications of things, that is, to fail the perception that there is something to be guessed and traced, right or wrong, requires that we persistently coarsen and stupefy ourselves. So the worldview reinforces the idea that what skepticism poses a threat to is the ordinary, the everyday things, people and situations whose familiarity makes them all but invisible to us. It does this by disconnecting us from the world, by reminding us of the loss of the world and our attempts to overcome this break that push it further away. Recovering the world is therefore not a matter of imposing our will on it, but on finding a way back to the ordinary, to our everyday immersion in and acceptance of the world and our everyday acknowledgement of others, as David MacArthur has put it. And the worldview suggests that films can help us do that by reanimating our powers of perception. So acknowledgement. This is the key thing that emerges from the worldview, and it's a very important concept for Cavell. One route, perhaps, to recover what has been lost to us. Or, perhaps better put, it is one way to accept the world that it is, as something separate from us, but which we are nonetheless responsible to and for. Let's return to Shakespeare to better explain. For Cavell, Shakespeare's plays, notably the tragedies, interpret and reinterpret the sceptical problematic by drawing parallels between our knowledge of the external world and our knowledge of other minds. In doing so, they make manifest a key philosophical principle, that the proper response to our contemporary crisis is not an issue of knowledge, at least where knowledge is equated with certainty, but a matter of acknowledgement, an alternative form of relating and responding that begins with the subject's recognition of the other's separation from me and also their specific relation to me. Acknowledgement is not the opposite of knowledge, rather it acts on knowledge. From my acknowledgement that I'm late, it follows that I know I'm late. But from my knowing I am late, it does not follow that I acknowledge I am late. So one could say acknowledgement goes beyond knowledge. It's a requirement that I do something or reveal something. And I was thinking about acknowledgement when we were talking about statistics earlier on. Attempts at acknowledgement reveal us, who we take ourselves to be, how we picture our relationship to others. An acknowledgement of the fact that I can never know the world, or indeed never know my partner's mind, is not grounds for the termination of a relationship, but a starting point. So Lear's avoidance of Cordelia's love is a failure of acknowledgement, as is Othello's inability to withstand the fact of Desdemona's privacy. And in both these cases, a failure to acknowledge the other leads to their literal deaths. These are extreme cases of how falling victim to skepticism can wreak destruction on the world and other people. But, lest we choose to console ourselves that we are not Lear or Othello, that our comportment in the world is different, Cavell reminds us that the sceptical impulse reverberates through the smallest of thoughts and gestures, and this is what film is uniquely placed to show us. Shakespeare and his great tragedies remind us of the literal life and death importance of acknowledgement, but film has a privileged relationship to the everyday, ordinary violence that skepticism deals with because it allows us to watch close up as these small acts of destruction are dealt and suffered while men and women go about their daily lives. Film, he says, shows us, I quote, that in our slights of one another, in an underexpressed or disguised meanness of thought, in a hardness of glance, a casual indiscriminateness of praise or blame, in any of the countless signs of scepticism with respect to the reality, the separateness of another, we run the risk of suffering or dealing little deaths every day. And since these little deaths have to do with the ways that individuals acknowledge or fail to acknowledge their difference from others and to forge a relationship that's the basis for community, it follows that their setting is domestic. Cavell claims that since human intimacy or marriage or domestication has become available as the fictional equivalent of what philosophers of ordinary language consider to be the ordinary, then naturally, he says, the threat to the ordinary that philosophy names skepticism should show up in fiction's favourite threats to marriage, namely in the forms of melody and tragedy, melodrama and tragedy, but also in their antonym, the comedy. And that takes us on to Cavell's work on genre, which Hugo's I think we've got exactly the same images on our slides. So the classical films that Cavell writes about in his two books on film genre and philosophy, Pursuits of Happiness, the Hollywood comedy of remarriage, and Contesting Tears, the Hollywood melodrama of the unknown woman, allegorize the skeptical crisis through the metaphor of marriage as it features in both of these genres. Each model acknowledgement. In the former, separateness is acknowledged through laughter and rebuke, in the latter through tears. Across both, what is at stake is how to live in the face of doubt. The films discussed in Pursuits of Happiness. Oh, look, there's my well-viewed slide. The films discussed in Pursuits of Happiness, a book that Cavell describes as an expression of the relief in completing the study of skepticism in the claim of reason, go some way to answering that question of how we live in the face of doubt, presenting us with a model of acknowledgement and describing the paths that characters each take to reach a point where they will happily abandon the pursuit of knowledge in favour of happiness. The implication being, of course, that the two ends are mutually exclusive. In this book, as we've heard, Cavell groups together 7 films of the 1930s and 40s and argues that they are linked by a common myth of overcoming skepticism. In each of these films, a couple who may or may not be married split up, driven apart not by outside forces, but by an internal quarrel to do with jealousy, mistrust, contempt, or condescension. The narrative of the film traces their journey back together again, by way of an acknowledgement of their separateness and the importance of seeing the world not as though from the same perspective, but with an awareness that each other's perspective may be equally valid. I think it's worth noting here, as Cavell does, that these films emerge at a particular moment in the US history of women's rights when, after the success of the suffragist movement, culminating in the winning of the vote for women in 1920, it's widely held that women's rights fell somewhat off the political agenda up until the 1970s. Cavell actually uses these films to rebut that claim, citing Alice S. Rossi's argument that, I quote, "The generation that followed the activist generation may have been consolidating feminist ideas into the private stuff of their lives and seeking new outlets for the expression of the values that prompted their mother's public behaviour." The female stars of these films, Katharine Hepburn, Claudette Colbert, Barbara Stanwyck, Rosalind Russell, were all of the right age to be daughters of that suffrage movement. And moreover, this is a point when divorce is rapidly on the rise. In 1890, 3 couples per 1,000 in the US were divorced. By 1920, that figure was 8 in 1,000, and it kept going up. So in short, and this is important because remarriage only becomes a possibility alongside divorce, and women's subjectivity becomes a particularly pressing problem when it can lead not only to infidelity, as in Shakespeare and The Winter's Tale, but also to abandonment, a double threat to male security. These films have happy endings. The men and women who populate them overcome what we would call, in contemporary parlance, their insecurities, and in Cavell's words, the threat of skepticism, through the act of conversation. Cavell explains that in the remarriage comedies, talking together is fully and plainly being together, a mode of association, a form of life. He writes that in these films, the central pair are learning to speak the same language. And it's really important that the tone of that conversation takes a certain form. Cavell says that conversation within these films is a source of pleasure for both the audience and the central couple alike. And anyone that's seen any of these screwball comedies will know that the dialogue is incredibly rapid. It's very quick fire. I think His Girl Friday has the fastest dialogue still to date of any film in the English language. Cavell also comments, and this is a standing joke between me and my husband, and no comment on the state of my marriage, I promise, that the form of discourse most readily associated with marriage is bickering. That the characteristic sound of these comedies is the sound of argument, of wrangling, of verbal battle. Such bickering is an invitation to see oneself as part of a community, if only a community of two, and a call for acceptance, which does not mean that which does not only mean that being is agreed with, only that disagreement must claim for itself the standing of philosophy. What he means here is that to rebuke someone is to enter or acknowledge already being entered into a relationship, a first person plural. It is to say that her opinion, her reading matters, if only by dint of its wrongness. This is opposed to the possibility of others refusing to meet on that ground, not contesting the claim that this is what we say, but disdaining the idea that there is a we at all. This is the path represented by divorce, that I refuse to recognise a relationship any longer. And another aside, just very quickly, I've been thinking a lot about bickering in relationship to banter, which, as we all know, Donald Trump is very fond of, and when bickering becomes banter, which I haven't quite thought through, but I think is a very important question, and actually something that Jacqueline Rose starts to get to within her wonderful book. So given that the refusal of acknowledgement is represented by divorce, it's very little surprise that the question of divorce, of turning one's back on the other, surfaces in Contesting Tears, a book that Cavell defines as a sequel or companion of sorts to Pursuits of Happiness. Here, Cavell looks back on the remarriage comedies and acknowledges himself a taint of male villainy that attaches itself to the male figures in remarriage, one which is perhaps most explicit in Peter Warne's assertion in It Happened One Night, that what Claudette Colbert's Ali Andrews needs is a guy that would take a sock at her once a day, whether she deserves it or not, or in Adam Bonner's delivery of a slug, not a slap, to his wife Amanda. And with a bit of luck, we can watch that scene now.
What's the matter? Don't you want your own now? What are you, sore about a little slap?
No.
Well, what then?
You meant that, didn't you? You really meant that.
Why?
Yes, you did. I can tell. I know your touch. I know a slap from a slug.
Well, okay.
I'm not so sure it is. I'm not so sure I care to expose myself to typical, instinctive, masculine brutality.
Oh, come
And it
on.
felt not only as though you meant it, but as though you felt you had a right to. I can tell.
What have you got back there? Radar equipment?
You're really sore at me, aren't you?
Oh, don't be ridiculous.
There. Prove it.
All right. I am sore. What about it?
Why are you?
You know why.
You mean Kit? Just because he's having a little fun?
No, because you're having a little fun. You're having the wrong kind of fun down in that courtroom. You're shaking the law by the tail, and I don't like it. I'm ashamed of you, Amanda.
Is that so?
Yes, that's so. We've had our little differences, and I've always tried to see your point of view. But this time you've got me stumped, baby.
You haven't tried to see my point of view. You haven't even any respect for my...
There we go. Oh, here we go again. The old juice. Guaranteed heart melter. A few female tears. Stronger than any acid. But this time they won't work. You can try from now until the time the jury comes in, and it won't make you right, and it won't bring you that sunny taste.
Adam! Please, stop!
You want your rub down? baby. What, honey? Ow!
Let's all be manly.
A slug from a slap, bickering from banter maybe, is one that the marriage comedies work out, and it's one that the couples within them work out between them. Although I do think that says there is, a kind of real taint of gender violence that sifts through that, and I think filters through all of the films in different ways. And my students are actually often quite shocked by that scene when I show it to them. Although we do see Katharine Hepburn giving as good as she gets, which is one of the kind of, again, tests of what a good marriage should be in terms of, in Cavell's view. And of course, since this is a comedy of remarriage, Adam is ultimately, at the end of the film, redeemed by his ability to tread the line between a real pistol and a licorice one, a slap and a slug. But the men of the melodramas are not equally able to recognise that expressions even of villainous antagonism should not violate certain distinctions. There is something that crosses a line in the melodramas, that displaces or perhaps makes explicit something that's implicit in the battle of the sexes play fighting that runs through the comedies. Cavell gives names to the specific forms of villainy or inadequacy that these films show us, and the most obvious, I think, kind of polarised example of this is indeed Gaslight. Cavell refers to the old-fashioned fixated menace. I'd go a bit further than that, I think, of the anti-hero in that film. And that has, of course, as we know by now, been sort of adopted as a kind of signal text for the contemporary Me Too movement. I'm more interested in some ways in what Cavell calls the virtuosic self-absorption and compulsive seductiveness of Louis Jourdain's Stéphane Brand in Letter from an Unknown Woman, a character who one of my students, if you'll excuse my French, referred to as the original fuckboy. It's most insidious in the courteous but advancing irrelevance of the male characters in Now Voyager, and the perceptual incompetence of Stephen Dallas in Stella Dallas. And here he is, in a very short clip, failing to read between the lines of his wife's behaviour. She says,
Stella, I've been thinking, I don't know why it didn't occur to me before, but there's no earthly reason in the world why you should spend the day all alone, just because I've been selfish and thoughtless. There must be a later train. Where's the telephone? Shall we call and see?
Oh, yes.
Please. Beacon Hill, 3700, please.
Foolish, didn't I? Shoot from there to the back door, went all the way around and came right in here. Just where is all this company that I'm being kicked out because of? Because I'm going to tell you this. You're not going to feed a boy turkey. No, sir. Not this.
I beg your pardon. I guess. Oh, I'm sorry, Sol. I didn't mean to. I guess I'll go now. Mr. Dallas.
Had a little too much Christmas, I guess. He was here a while ago and brought a turkey, and I had a terrible time getting rid of him. How did you find out about the train?
Well, I'm afraid it would be too late, Stella. I'm sorry.
so in that scene, I mean, I'm guessing everyone's seen Stella Dallas before. Has anybody not seen Stella Dallas? Good. As a reminder, we see Stephen Dallas, who's abandoned his wife already once for being too much herself, too loud, too gaudy, too aspirational, entranced by her appearance as a doting mother and demure homemaker. He invites her to join him for Christmas, but rescinds the offer after her friend and drinking buddy makes an appearance, reminding him of her unbiddable nature. Stephen is jealous. dismissive, snobbish, cruel. I think maybe like Mr. Ramsay, a little bit needy. Whether he's willfully blind to Stella's rich and multifaceted inner life or simply stupid, it doesn't really matter. When the reality fails to match the ideal, he turns his back. And note the way that the two-shot of the pair, and that two shot's a really common device within the remarriage comedies, so we see both characters in this scene at once, gives way to a pair of shot reverse shots, while the literal image of Stephen's turned back dominates the latter part of the sequence. And I think I was reminded too, Emma, as you were talking about this idea of violence as mute, the dialogue here is very awkward, it's slow, it's stilted. It's quite the opposite of that very fast-paced, wisecracking dialogue that we see in the comedies. The sound of bickering and in-jokes is replaced by stilted small talk and missed meanings. And that shot of Stella's face as she realises that chance is disappearing over the horizon, that casual cruelty, is to my mind one of the most heartbreaking in cinema. It's more heartbreaking, I think, than the very famous final image of Barbara Stanwyck walking off into the sunset, not sunset, but into the darkness. And in the melodramas of The Unknown Woman, the woman's effort to understand why recognition by the man hasn't happened or has been denied is characterised by Cavell specifically as a struggle over her gender. That's his phrase. He writes that it is as if the women of the melodramas are saying to their sisters in the comedies, "You may call yourselves lucky to have found a man with whom you can overcome the humiliation of marriage by marriage itself. For us, with our talents and tastes, there is no further or happy education to be found there. Our integrity and metamorphosis happens elsewhere, in the abandoning of that shared wit and intelligence and exclusive appreciation." Conversely, Cavell writes, the woman's knowledge becomes the object of the man's fantasy as they seek to share it, be ratified it, to escape it or destroy it. And Cavell asks specifically, what do women know? Do they escape doubt? This might sound like a strange question, I think. Any of the women in the room will know full well that women don't escape doubt. But it becomes clearer that what Cavell is driving at when he returns to Shakespeare, in this instance, The Winter's Tale. And as we've heard about from Andrew, this play turns on a central conflict between Leontes and Hermione, which has to do not merely with her fidelity, but of whether he is indeed the father of the child that she says is his. And so from this, Cavell makes, I think, a somewhat baffling leap, connecting man's doubt as to whether his children are his to the problem of scepticism more widely, and in the process suggesting that philosophical scepticism is, and I quote, a male business. However, he swiftly caveats this suggestion, writing that this is not to say that women do not get in the way of scepticism, that's quoting again, but rather that the object of this doubt is different. Women might not doubt that their children are their own, but they do doubt the suitability of the children's father. So Cavellian scepticism in Contesting Tears is once more a matter of asymmetry between the genders. Scepticism is not the same for a woman as it is for a man. There are certain certainties that women have available to them that men do not, and men want to know what these certainties are, hence Othello's obsession with Desdemona's knowledge. So Cavell doesn't really provide an immediate answer to the question of what women's privileged knowledge is. Rather, he re-emphasises this question of unknownness or privacy, pointing to the ability of women, and certain stars in particular, Garbo, Davis, Dietrich, amongst others, to see and judge the world in a way that remains beyond the grasp of their male counterparts. This ability, he claims, comes from a state of isolation so extreme as to portray and partake of madness, a state of utter incommunicability, as if before the possession of speech. And again, that's very clear within Gaslight, and if you watch the film, you'll see how many times Ingrid Bergman raises her hand to her mouth, as if there's just blocking the possibility of speech. And it's this privacy that becomes a source of fascination for their male counterparts and of threat, which is why at the end of these films, so many women disappear or die. And for the closing part of this talk, I'd like to draw these threads together, if you'll allow me, by looking at how both of these themes play out amongst the central triad of François Truffaut's 1962 film, Jules and Jim, Jules et Jim, a film which shows the attempt at recovering the world through friendship and community, collapse, fall to violence and hopelessness. This is a film that Cavell writes about in passing, thinking in particular about the use of the freeze frame, but it's also a work that's ripe for thinking about violence, and particularly the gendering of violence. So the film turns around a relationship between the two titular men. You can see them on screen here. Jules is the blonde, played by Oscar Werner. Jim has the moustache. And a woman, Catherine, played by the incandescent Jeanne Moreau. It's telling that Jeanne is excluded from the film's title. It already hints at her place, or her lack of one, within the film's dynamics of acknowledgement. From the outset, this is the story of two men, a German and a Frenchman, whose friendship is forged on the eve of war, and who will not, whatever the odds, willingly let comradeship and desire and art and politics destroy the place of each in each. Let's look at Jules and Jim meeting for the first time. These are the opening titles.
C'était vers 1912. Jules, étranger à Paris, avait demandé à Jim, qu'il connaissait à peine, de le faire entrer au bal des Quatre Arts. Jim lui avait procuré une carte et l'avait amené chez le costumier. C'est pendant que Jules fouillait doucement parmi les étoffes et se choisissait un simple costume d'esclave que naquit l'amitié de Jim pour Jules. Elle grandit pendant le bal où Jules fut tranquille, avec des yeux comme des boules, pleins d'humour et de tendresse. Le lendemain, ils eurent leur première vraie conversation, puis ils se virent tous les jours. Chacun enseignait à l'autre jusque tard dans la nuit sa langue et sa littérature. Ils se montraient leurs poèmes et les traduisaient ensemble. Ils avaient aussi en commun une relative indifférence envers l'argent, et ils causaient sans hâte, aucun des deux n'ayant jamais trouvé un auditeur si attentif. Jules n'avait pas de femme dans sa vie parisienne et il en souhaitait une. Jim en avait plusieurs. Il lui fit rencontrer une jeune musicienne, le début sembla favorable, Jules fut un peu amoureux une semaine et elle aussi, puis ce fut un joli bout de femme désinvolte qui tenait le coup dans les cafés mieux que les poètes jusqu'à 6 heures du matin. Une autre fois, ce fut une jolie veuve toute blonde. Ils eurent des sorties à trois. Elle déconcertait Jules qu'elle trouvait gentil mais ballot et amena pour lui une amie placide, mais Jules la trouva placide. Enfin, malgré l'avis de Jim, Jules prit contact avec des professionnels mais sans y trouver satisfaction.
Okay, so although we don't get any dialogue here, there is, I think, something of the remarriage comedy in the ambience of this opening sequence. In their friendship, Jules and Jim exemplify in many ways the same dynamic as the central pair in the remarriage comedy. The first image is of the two of them, side by side. The actors are introduced together, not separately. We have this bombastic circus-like music as the two clown around, they play fight, they jump on one another's backs. They are Laurel and Hardy. The narrative opens on them playing cards, and we're told that of their first meeting, how Jules asks Jim to a dance, which is something we would expect between a heterosexual couple perhaps, and how friendship blossoms as the pair choose their costumes. In a whirlwind montage, we see their relationship deepen. They learn each other's languages and translate each other's poems. They attempt to acknowledge the other by understanding the world from their linguistic perspective. Neither had ever found such a good listener, we're told. And throughout, they mostly appear on screen together, and when they don't initially appear to do so, a whip pan reveals that they are in fact sharing the same space. We're encouraged to share in this friendship, to stand alongside them, at a couple of moments when the camera does a 360-degree pan, so it sort of swirls us into the action. Their commitment to one another testifies, in Cavell's words, that the relationship between self and community is an undying dialectic. The appearance of Catherine into their lives is presaged by the men's discovery of an ancient statue, which you can see bottom left here. When they finally meet her, they see her as the statue come to life, and that's an impression that's rendered by a freeze frame. She is thus, and this is from the film, their creation, their greatest work as artists, the one work on which they could stake their lives. Catherine represents, that is, the joining of the two men's minds, and this is a communion that Cavell, in his short reading of the film, understands in a positive light. She is, in a sense, he says, their child, the product of their union. But, as Stella Dallas has taught us, the parent is bound to give the child up, to mourn her loss, having taught her in turn how to mourn the world. This is not the trajectory that Jules and Jim takes. Instead, Jules will attempt to tame Catherine's wildness, to possess her completely through a conventional marriage that she chafes against. She's unhappy at the confinement of the marital bonds and frustrated by Jules's refusal to acknowledge her flaws and her needs, his Othello-like need to possess her and know her entirely. He in turn transfers his affections to their child, Sabine, who fits more easily into his paternalistic model of love and education. Jim, meanwhile, retreats from Catherine. A love affair between the two of them fizzles out after the demands that she places on him threaten to overwhelm him. He turns his back on her, just as Lear does Cordelia. In Cavell's positivist reading of the film, Catherine exceeds her status as an aesthetic object, a mere totem of Jules and Jim's community, and to some extent he's correct. Or at least to some extent I agree with him. Indeed, Catherine asserts her individuality and her agency over the two men towards the film's end when she, spoiler for anyone that hasn't seen it, drives the car that she and Jim are in off the road and into a lake in an act of murder-suicide. That ends their relationship to the world once and for all and leaves Jules alone to grieve. Perhaps this is her own act of Othello-like jealousy. Or perhaps, as Cavell has it, it is a reproach to the pair of men whose friendship has faltered and who have failed to uphold their vows of community. He sees the film's triumph as showing Catherine to be alive and separate, arguing that it is only the marriage of one pair in the friendship that tips the balance between the three and collapses the triad. Catherine's death, and that of Jim, is a relief to Jules because he is freed of the demands that she placed on him to make room for incompatible faiths. And yet, in the sequence that I'm about to show, I think we can see how the two men are always more concerned with each other than they are with her, even before anyone gets married.
S'il vous plaît, demain soir on sera à Paris.
Catherine, Jules.
Bonjour.
Ça y est, j'ai signé avec mon éditeur.
Ah,
Voilà, ça c'est pour Catherine.
merci.
Ça c'est pour vous deux.
Oh, c'est beau.
Formidable. Là, il y a un carton.
Qu'est-ce que c'est?
C'est une petite main pour se gratter le dos. C'est très pratique. Voilà.
Ah non.
Je vous emmène au théâtre. J'ai pris 3 places pour ce soir.
Qu'est-ce qu'on va voir au théâtre?
Une nouvelle pièce d'un auteur suédois.
Ah bon.
Le théâtre est à 9 heures. Quand le sable sera en bas, il faudra nous habiller.
Jim vit souvent ses amis, il se plaisait avec eux. Le grand lit mérovingien était inauguré officieusement, les 2 oreillers de Jules étaient maintenant côte à côte sur son lit et ce lit sentait bon. Catherine embellissait et reprenait racine dans la vie.
Malgré tout, cette fille me plaît. Elle veut être libre. Elle invente sa vie à chaque instant.
Jim n'a pas l'air enchanté.
Non, franchement non. C'est une pièce confuse et complaisante. Encore un de ces types qui prétendent peindre le vice pour mieux montrer la vertu.
On ne sait pas à quelle époque ça se passe, ni dans quel milieu. L'auteur n'a pas expliqué si l'héroïne est vierge ou non.
Ça n'a aucune importance.
Cela n'aurait aucune importance si le conflit était purement sentimental, mais puisque l'auteur précise que le héros est impuissant, que son frère est homosexuel et que sa belle-sœur est nymphomane, il nous doit des précisions physiques sur l'héroïne. C'est logique, non?
Non. Et puis d'abord, vous ne pensez qu'à ça.
Parfaitement, madame. On ne pense qu'à ça et vous nous y aidez.
Pas de psychologie ce soir, Jules.
Ce n'est pas de la psychologie, c'est de la métaphysique. Dans le couple, l'important, c'est la fidélité de la femme. Celle de l'homme est secondaire. Qui a écrit « La femme est naturelle, donc abominable »
C'est Baudelaire, mais il parlait des femmes d'un certain monde et d'une certaine société.
Mais pas du tout, il parlait de la femme en général. Ce qu'il dit de la jeune fille, c'est magnifique. Épouvantail, monstre, assassin de l'art, dite sotte, petite salope. La plus grande imbécilité unie avec la plus grande dépravation. Oh, un instant, je n'ai pas fini. Et c'est si admirable. J'ai toujours été étonné qu'on laisse entrer les femmes dans l'église. Quelles conversations peuvent-elles avoir avec Dieu?
Vous êtes deux idiots.
Moi, je n'ai rien dit et je n'approuve pas forcément ce que dit Jules à 2 heures du matin.
Alors protestez.
Je proteste.
Le plongeon de Catherine se grava dans les yeux de Jim au point qu'il en fit le lendemain un dessin, lui qui ne dessinait pas. Un éclair d'admiration jaillit en lui, tandis qu'il envoyait à Catherine par la pensée un baiser invisible. Il était tranquille, il nageait mentalement avec elle et gardait son souffle pour bien effrayer Jules.
Catherine, pourquoi?
Oh, Catherine, par là, venez.
Catherine, tu es fou.
Par là, Catherine. Prenez ma main. Catherine.
Tu es fou.
Le chapeau de Catherine suivait tout seul le fil de l'eau.
Anyone's seen Adam's Rib? I think there's a really fabulous comparison to be made in terms of hats and what happens to hats in these two films, but that's a paper for another day. What we can see in this clip is that from the earliest days of their friendship, even before Jules and Catherine marry, neither man is willing to challenge Catherine in good humour, to speak to her as an equal. She is a goddess, a queen, all women, a statue that is literally on a pedestal or at least a plinth. Jules is weak and placatory. Jim, on the other hand, refuses to meet her demands for a sparring partner. This, for Cavell, is the ultimate betrayal of friendship. If good-natured disagreement is the true sound of friendship, if bickering is the sound of a good marriage, then the refusal to argue, to try and find mutual territory, is the denial of any connection at all. He puts it as not contesting the claim that this is what we say, but disdaining the idea that there is a we at all. And as I've mentioned, to argue with someone is to enter or to acknowledge already being entered into a community. It is to say that that person's opinion matters. To dismiss someone is an annihilation. So long before Catherine drives her car off a cliff, she has been denied her humanity through the denial of these two men who prefer, it seems, not to see her as herself, but as a product of their own imagination. Catherine's plunge into the water, a little death every day, anticipates her final tragic demise. Set in the shadow of death, the backdrop of 2 world wars, the film makes clear that the seeds of destruction are sown in the ordinary conversations, or lack thereof, between men and women. And I'm coming to a conclusion now, you'll be pleased to hear. Across the body of his film philosophy, Cavell makes a case for what cinema has to teach us about our commitments to the world and to each other. In a world where the temptation to lose faith in the power of human action and human relationships is powerful. As a moving image of skepticism, film reminds us that while we may feel divorced from the world, uncertain of how sincerely we should take it and its inhabitants to be, its call on us nonetheless demands acknowledgement. Can I know that climate change is real? I cannot. Should I nonetheless consider the possibility to ask something significant of me? Yes, I should. And just so, should I know the statistic? Do I know that these statistics about domestic violence and gender violence are accurate? Do I know what that experience of living under those conditions is? No, I do not. But nonetheless, I am called upon to acknowledge that and to act. And that is what film tells us. By exposing the ways in which our falling victim to skepticism can deal 1,000 little deaths every day in the smallest and most banal of ways, it shows us how our fear and our carelessness can drive the world further from us and make us complicit in the structuring of that world. And of course, it's a human tendency not to embrace our shared uncertainties, but to avoid them, to close our eyes to the other human persons in their separateness and complexity, a tendency that Cavell, that I, was guilty of as anyone else. In his final book of philosophy and film criticism, Philosophy the Day After Tomorrow, Cavell writes that in the everyday ways in which denial occurs in my life with the other, in a momentary irritation or a recurrent grudge, in an unexpected rush of resentment, in a hard glance, in a dishonest attestation, in the telling of a tale, in the believing of a tale, in a false silence, in a fear of engulfment, in a fantasy of solitude, of self-destruction. The problem is to recognize myself as denying another, to understand that I carry chaos in myself. Here is the scandal of skepticism with respect to the existence of others. I am the scandal. Reading his work, watching these films, we learn that in our life, in our every word and every gesture, we bear responsibility for the world we share. And this brings me finally to Jacqueline Rose, whose book on violence and on violence against women was the inspiration for this conference, where she argues that, she says that the central premise for the book is that violence in our time thrives on a form of mental blindness, what she calls the will distortion, whether conscious or unconsciousness, in the field of vision. I believe this is a form of skepticism in itself. So what I hope to have shown is how film in all its forms has the capacity to restore to us, if only briefly, that vision, if only we are willing to see. Where we go from there is up to us. Thank you.